On a night thick with smoke and whiskey, Elias Mercer, a widowed rancher hollowed by loss, won not money but 2 newborn babies in a poker game. From that moment, his life was bound to storms that would test his strength, to enemies who would spill blood for what they claimed, and to an unexpected love that would rise quietly from firelight and snow. Elias Mercer had never been much of a gambler. The saloon saw him most evenings, but never as one of its loud, laughing men. He sat at the far end of the card table, not because he loved the turn of the deck, but because it dulled the hours between sundown and the silence of his house. He rarely won, rarely lost. He played as a man plays with sand slipping through his fingers, unhurried, without much care. The night it happened was bitter cold, the wind whining like a stray dog through the gaps in the swinging doors. The lamps burned low, smoke pooling around the ceiling beams. Elias's hat shadowed his scar-lined face, and his hands, heavy with years of rope and reins, moved slow over his cards. He was a widower of 6 years, his wife Clara carried away by fever one spring when the pear trees had just started to bloom. Since then, the land had offered him little but dust, failed harvests, and nights that stretched too long. The poker game had carried on the same as always until a drifter, thin as bone, stinking of sweat and whiskey, shoved his last coins forward. When those were lost, he muttered, swore, and then, almost as if mocking heaven, placed 2 small bundles on the table. At first, Elias thought it some cruel jest. But when one bundle stirred and a weak cry split the haze of smoke, the room went dead quiet. 2 infants, their faces flushed and raw from the cold, swaddled in rags that had once been part of a woman's dress. The men at the table cursed. Some laughed uneasily. Others spat on the floor. "Ain't worth nothin'," someone muttered. "Best left where they came from." The drifter sneered, saying their mother was long gone, their father as good as dead, and he himself had no use for mouths that couldn't work. Elias did not think. He played the hand before him as he always had, without eagerness, without hope. And yet when the cards settled, it was his pile the bundles slid toward. No one protested. No one wanted them. When Elias lifted the infants into his arms, their weight seemed both featherlight and crushing. He left the saloon in silence, ignoring the smirks and mutters that trailed him into the night. The road back to his homestead was long, a path cut through frost-hardened fields. The moon hung low, a pale coin in the sky. The babies cried the whole way, their tiny voices carrying across the prairie like the cries of lost birds. Elias walked with his collar turned against the wind, boots crunching over frozen earth, wondering if he had just taken leave of his senses. The house loomed at last, a weather-beaten thing crouched against the plain. Once, it had been a home, filled with the hum of Clara's song, the smell of stew on the fire, the warmth of a woman's touch. Now it stood hollow. Dust lay thick on the windowsills, tools rusted where they leaned by the door. Inside, he set the twins down by the fire and stoked the coals until the room glowed faintly orange. The rocking chair beside the hearth creaked as the wind touched it, Clara's shawl still draped over the back. He had never moved it, never could. It seemed for a moment that she might walk in, take up the chair, and hush the children as only she had known how. But the chair remained empty, and the shawl smelled only of dust. The infants wailed. Elias, clumsy in the ways of care, fumbled with cloth and kettle, managing little but spilled milk and burned fingers. His hands, so steady with a rifle or plow, shook when they held such fragile life. By the time the fire had burned low, he sank onto the floorboards with his back to the wall, the 2 tiny bundles pressed against his chest. Neighbors came the next morning when word spread. Some shook their heads, muttering that Elias Mercer had finally gone mad. Others pitied him, whispering of the fever that had taken Clara and the loneliness that had followed him like a hound ever since. None offered help. Settlers out here had little to spare, and besides, who would burden themselves with another man's lost cause? The land itself seemed to resist the choice he had made. Cold wind rattled the shutters, dust curled under the door, and the rafters moaned as if the house itself disapproved. Elias worked harder than ever, splitting wood, hauling water, mending fences while the babies cried in the background. At night, their wails filled the hollow rooms, louder than coyotes, sharper than silence. There were moments he nearly carried them back to town, ready to thrust them into another man's arms, or leave them at the church steps. But something stopped him each time. Perhaps it was the memory of Clara's yearning for children they never had. Perhaps it was the way one of the infants, the girl, gripped his finger with a strength that seemed to challenge the world itself. Or perhaps it was simply that Elias Mercer, though he felt unworthy of life's trust, could not bring himself to abandon souls more forsaken than his own. That first week was a blur of exhaustion, firelight, and the hollow ache of doubt. He rose, before dawn, his body aching, his mind clouded with grief, and still the work of the ranch demanded his hands. Between tending cattle and mending broken tools, he learned to mix milk, to swaddle, to hush. He learned that infants carried the smell of earth after rain, soft and new, and that their breath against his chest softened even the hardest hours. Yet when night fell, and the shawl in the rocking chair caught the fire's glow, the emptiness returned sharper than before. Clara was gone, the house remembered her, and Elias, though he held two small lives in his arms, felt as if he were grasping at smoke. And still, in the marrow of that bitter season, something stirred. It was not joy, nor hope. Those were luxuries too far. It was only a flicker, faint as the ember that clung to ash in the stove, but it burned nonetheless. A sense that fate, or God, or the cruel hand of chance, had set before him a test. Elias Mercer did not yet know whether he would pass it, but as he sat in the silence of his home, the twins pressed close against him. He knew one thing clear as the cold wind. Whatever burden he had carried before was no longer his alone. Days stretched into weeks, and Elias Mercer found himself caught between two hungers: the cry of the land for a man's labor, and the cry of two infants for a father's hand. Both called at once, both without mercy. The ranch did not wait for grief. Cattle broke fences, water buckets split at their seams, tools rusted where he had left them too long in the rain. Winter pressed closer with every dawn, and Elias felt his strength pulled in two directions. He had always worked with a steady rhythm, as if the earth itself had claimed him in partnership, but now every hour seemed divided. Half his body bent to toil, half his heart stumbling after the fragile breaths of children who depended on him with a ferocity greater than the sun itself. Inside the house, memory ruled. The walls whispered of Clara. Her wedding dress still lay folded in the cedar trunk at the foot of their bed, the lace yellowed with time but still carrying the faint smell of lavender. Her braids hung in his mind, long and dark, the way she had worn them on Sundays. In the kitchen, the iron kettle still bore the soot of her last stew, and the shelf by the window held the cup she favored, chipped at the rim. Everywhere Elias turned, Clara lived. And yet, everywhere Elias turned, Clara was gone. The twins filled the silence with cries sharp enough to rattle his bones. At night, their wails pierced the stillness of the prairie, drowning even the howl of coyotes. Elias rose from bed again and again, fumbling in the dark. His hands, calloused from rope, axe, and rifle, were too clumsy for the small work of warming milk or swaddling cloth. More than once he spilled the bottle, soaking both himself and the children. More than once he laid them in the cradle only to hear their cries rise again before he had crossed the room. Fatigue carved deep shadows beneath his eyes. He began to resent the silence of the prairie, the endless sweep of dust and grass that seemed to mock his efforts. Neighbors passed along fences or at the edge of the well, offering no more than sharp glances and muttered judgment. He heard the whispers. Elias Mercer, the widower who can't keep a crop alive, now playing nursemaid to another man's brats. Their words stung more than he wished to admit. He already carried the weight of failure in his chest. Their looks only drove it deeper. At times, Elias believed he had been cursed. Clara taken, his land barren, his body weary, and now this strange burden thrust upon him by the roll of cards. Some nights he sat at the hearth, the fire low, the rocking chair creaking in the draught. Clara's shawl still hung there untouched, a relic he could not put away. He would sit with his head in his hands, the children's cries gnawing at him, like teeth, and wonder if he had made the greatest mistake of his life. Yet life has its way of softening stone. One evening, after a day that had begun with a broken fence and ended with a calf lost to wolves, Elias sat by the fire with one of the twins in his arms. His back ached, his eyes burned, his soul felt hollow. The infant, a boy, squirmed restlessly, fussing and weak from hunger. Elias muttered a prayer he did not believe would be heard, words half-formed, little more than breath. He thought of Clara, her hand once steady on his, her voice once strong enough to lift him through his darkest hours. And then it happened. The child's tiny hand, no larger than the knot of Elias's thumb, closed around his finger. It was no soft gesture, no idle twitch. The grip was fierce, commanding, alive. Elias froze, the world narrowing to that fragile strength. In that moment something cracked inside him. Not the healing of grief, not yet. But a softening. A yielding. The stone of his heart, ground down by years of loss, gave way to something he had not felt in so long he had forgotten the shape of it. Belonging. His throat tightened. He whispered Clara's name into the dimness, as though speaking it might bridge the distance between this firelit room and the earth that covered her. He looked at the child and realized, painfully, undeniably, that though he could not bring her back, life had given him something to carry forward, not to replace, not to erase, but to honor. The days that followed did not suddenly brighten. The twins still cried at all hours, the cattle still broke through the fence, the neighbors still muttered. Elias was still weary, still haunted, still afraid he was failing at everything he touched. But there was a difference now, quiet and unseen, like the first green shoot breaking through winter frost. When he held the children, he no longer felt only burden. He felt the faint tug of purpose. He began to hum, awkwardly, the way Clara once had when she cooked by the fire. He found himself speaking aloud, telling the children stories in rough, halting words. He spoke of their mother, though he did not know her name. He spoke of Clara, too, of the way she loved the land, of how her laughter once filled the house. He spoke not for them, but for himself, and yet their tiny faces seemed to listen, their eyes wide and unblinking in the glow of the fire. In the still hours before dawn, Elias would step outside, cradling one of the infants against his chest, and stare across the prairie. The land remained vast, silent, and hard. But now, beneath the cold stars, he felt something stir in him that was not despair. The wind still carried loneliness, but it also carried a whisper that he was not alone. Elias Mercer, once a man hollowed by grief, had taken in 2 forsaken souls. And in the shadows of his past, in the ache of memory and the weight of failure, he found the first fragile thread of endurance. It was not joy. It was not peace. But it was something to hold. And in that winter of doubt, it was enough. Autumn deepened, and with it came a sky that seemed ready to split in two. Clouds pressed low over the plains, heavy as iron, dragging long shadows across the fields. Elias had been mending the roof that morning, hammer ringing against shingles that wanted to curl and rot when he caught the first taste of the storm on the wind. Sharp, metallic, the scent of rain yet to fall. By nightfall, the heavens broke open. Rain lashed the earth in furious sheets, rattling the windows, and the prairie bent under a wind that howled like wolves circling the house. The fire within hissed and popped, its warmth fragile against the vast cold pressing down from the mountains. Elias fed the stove with what little dry wood he had managed to keep under cover, then checked on the twins. They lay restless, but quiet, swaddled near the hearth. A knock came suddenly, if knock it could be called. It was more a thud, a body, against the door, barely audible above the storm. Elias froze, hand tightening on the rifle by the wall. Few traveled in such weather, and fewer still came knocking uninvited. When he opened the door, the storm itself seemed to step inside. A woman stood there, drenched to the bone, hair plastered to her face, water streaming from her clothes. She carried a rifle slung across her back and a leather satchel clutched in her hand. Her skin bore bruises dark against her cheek, and her eyes, sharp, unyielding, met his as though daring him to turn her away. She said her name was Annika. Half settler, half from the nearby people of the River Nation. Her voice was hoarse, carried more by will than strength. She had walked miles, she said, fleeing men who thought her theirs to claim. She offered no details, nor did Elias ask. For a long moment he stood with the door wide, the storm battering against them both. Then he stepped aside, letting her pass. The room grew tense with her presence. Elias fetched a blanket from Clara's old chest, one of the few things he had not been able to part with, and handed it to her without a word. He poured coffee from the pot simmering on the stove, its bitter steam filling the air, and set it before her. She drank slowly, her eyes never leaving him, as if measuring what kind of man had taken her in. Silence held, broken only by the storm hammering the roof and the occasional whimper of the twins. Elias shifted in his chair, uneasy. He was not used to company beyond the small cries of children. The weight of another soul beneath his roof unsettled him, especially a woman scarred and armed, half belonging to a people most settlers whispered of with suspicion. But when the babies began to cry in earnest, Annika set down her cup and moved, without hesitation. She lifted the boy first, cradling him against her shoulder, rocking with a rhythm both firm and tender. Then she turned to the girl, swaddling tighter, whispering words in a tongue Elias did not know. The wails softened, small heads nestled into her arms, until the storm outside seemed louder than the infants themselves. Elias watched, something twisting in his chest. Where his rough hands fumbled, hers moved with surety. Where he had only blundered through trial and error, she carried an ease born of knowledge or perhaps instinct. In the flicker of firelight, the sight struck him. A stranger, soaked and battered by the world, holding the children he had barely begun to claim as his own, calming them as though she had always belonged there. When the work was done, she set them gently back in their cradle and returned to the fire. Neither spoke. The storm raged on, tearing at the shutters, shaking the house as if it might splinter. Shadows leapt high across the walls, thrown by the fire that hissed with every draft. Elias sat in the rocking chair, Clara's shawl still draped across it, his hands resting on the rifle across his knees. Annika sat opposite, the blanket wrapped around her shoulders, steam rising faintly from her damp hair. Their eyes met once, then turned away. It was not trust that lingered in the room, nor comfort. It was something quieter, heavier. Recognition. Recognition of the storms each had carried long before this one broke across the land. Recognition of loneliness, the kind that etched itself into bone and left scars no rain could wash away. When Annika finally spoke, it was not of herself. She asked of the children, where they had come from, how they had found their way into his arms. Elias gave the truth, plain as it was. A poker game. A hand he had not expected to win. She studied him as if searching for deceit, but when none came, she only nodded once and returned her gaze to the fire. Elias found no words to bridge the gulf between them. What could a broken widower and a hunted woman say that would not wound more deeply? And so they sat, letting the storm do the speaking. Hours passed. The storm began to wane, its fury softening to steady rain. The babies slept. Their breaths, shallow but even, their tiny fists curled as though holding on to dreams. The fire burned low, its glow dim, but enough to hold back the dark. Elias dozed where he sat, rifle across his knees, the rocking chair swaying gently with the wind. When he woke, Annika was still upright, eyes fixed on the fire, as if she had kept watch through the night. In that fragile dawn, as rain dripped from the eaves and the prairie lay silvered under clouds, Elias realized something wordless had passed between them. Not trust, not yet, but survival recognized survival and loneliness recognized its own. And that was enough. Days turned into a fragile arrangement as brittle as frost clinging to grass at dawn. Annika stayed, though she made it clear she owed Elias nothing. She spoke little of her past, and even less of her plans, but her hands moved with quiet purpose around the house. She rocked the children, stitched torn cloth, carried water from the well. When Elias worked in the fields, she was inside tending the stove, her figure cast in shadow and firelight, the twins held against her chest. Elias did not ask her to remain, nor did he bid her go. She was simply there, like the wind that creaked, the rafters or the dust that settled on the windowsills. Yet her presence changed the rhythm of the house. Where once the silence had been suffocating, now it carried an edge of unease. Two strangers circling around each other, bound by circumstance, neither willing to claim or release what lay between them. The prairie, too, took notice. Whispers traveled faster than wind. The widowed rancher with two strange children now harbored a woman of mixed blood beneath his roof. Settlers muttered in the trading post, in the churchyard, along the fence lines. Some called it sin, others folly. Few cared to see the truth. That Elias had taken her in on a night when the storm might have killed her. Fewer still considered that her hands had steadied the lives of children who might have perished without her. Annika heard the whispers in her own way. She had lived her whole life between two worlds, neither of which claimed her fully. From her mother's kin she bore the shape of her eyes, the dark hue of her hair, and the cadence of a language she still whispered in dreams. From her father's kin she bore a name, a tongue, and the pale scars of rejection. Now, under Elias's roof, she felt both halves judged at once. Elias saw the strain, though she hid it well. He noticed the tightness in her shoulders when neighbors passed too near. He noticed the way her gaze lingered on the rifle leaning against the wall, as though she trusted steel more than men. He noticed the scars, a thin line across her jaw, another running down her forearm, the kind not given by accident but by violence. And he noticed, too, the deeper scars, how she turned away from questions, how silence wrapped around her like armor. For his part, Elias wrestled with his own chains. Pride, guilt, and the fear of letting someone too close again weighed heavy. Each evening he sat by the fire, watching the rocking chair where Clara's shawl still rested. He could not move it, nor could he explain why. Annika never asked, but he felt her eyes on him as he stared at it, as though she knew the chair spoke of a wound not yet closed. Their days followed the turning of the season, morning chores, the cry of children, the hiss of water boiling over, the fire. Sometimes they spoke, short words about cattle or weather or the mending of cloth. Sometimes they did not. At night the house breathed with their unspoken burdens, the fire's glow flickering across faces carved by memory and mistrust. It might have gone on so, balanced on silence, had trouble not come calling. One gray afternoon, when the wind drove dust low across the prairie, a rider appeared at the gate. It was Thomas Hale, a neighbor known for his sharp tongue and sharper dealings. His horse stamped in the dirt as he leaned in the saddle, eyes narrow. He said goods had gone missing from the trading post, sacks of flour, a coil of rope, a tin kettle. The merchant had spoken of a woman seen nearby, dark-haired with a satchel, slung over her shoulder. Hale claimed it was Annika. Elias stood silent on the porch, jaw tight. The children slept inside, Annika just beyond the doorway, her rifle propped against the wall. She did not speak, but Elias felt the tension radiate from her, coiled like a bowstring. Hale pressed harder, saying such women were trouble, saying Elias had lost sense since Clara died, saying the sheriff would come if justice was not handled neighbor to neighbor. The words hung in the air, bitter as smoke. Elias had a choice. He could hand her over, let suspicion and prejudice carry her away. It would spare him whispers, perhaps even win him favor among those who already doubted him. Or he could stand beside her, though it meant making her burden his own. The wind rattled the shutters. Elias's hand tightened on the rail. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of stone. She stays. Hale's lip curled. He spat in the dirt, muttered about fools and their undoing, then turned his horse and rode back into the gray distance. Elias stood for a long while, watching the dust settle. When he turned, Annika was there, her expression unreadable. She did not thank him. She did not need to. The choice itself had bound their fates closer than either had intended. That night the house felt smaller, the air heavier. The fire burned low, shadows pressed close. The twins stirred in their cradle, restless in sleep. Elias sat again by the rocking chair, the shawl a silent ghost beside him. Across the room, Annika tended the stove, her profile etched in amber light. Their eyes met once, and though neither spoke, something shifted. Suspicion remained, unease lingered, but beneath it, trust began its slow, reluctant root. The roof creaked under the weight of wind. Two strangers sat in silence, each scarred, each abandoned in their own way. Yet in that fragile quiet they were no longer entirely alone. Winter came like a curtain drawn across the land. Snow fell thick over the plains, muffling sound, softening edges, swallowing the wide horizon into pale silence. The homestead stood like a lone sentinel in the white, smoke rising in a thin column from the chimney. Days blurred together, marked only by the rhythm of chores, the cries of the twins, and the measured sound of the wind at the door. The world shrank to four walls and the endless work of survival. Elias chopped wood until his arms ached, his breath rising in white clouds against the still air. Annika tended to the stove, her hands steady as she brewed coffee bitter enough to keep them awake through long nights. The rifle rested near the hearth, never far from reach, its steel glinting faintly in the firelight, a reminder that dangers beyond the snow still existed, though the storm of men and judgment had quieted for now. In that isolation, they found a kind of rhythm. Not harmony, not yet, but a pattern that held. Annika rose early with the children, her voice a quiet murmur in the gray dawn. Elias carried water from the well, breaking the ice with his axe before filling the buckets. They met in passing, exchanged few words, but shared the tasks that kept the small world alive. The silence between them was not empty. It was thick with things unsaid, with burdens carried close. They moved around each other carefully, like travelers sharing the same fire, uncertain if the warmth could last until morning. One night, the wind howled hard enough to shake the shutters, and the stove burned low, its red glow sinking toward ash. The twins, worn from the day, slept soundly in their cradle, their breaths small clouds in the dim light. Annika sat near the stove, shawl drawn close, her face carved in shadow. Elias sat in the rocking chair, Clara's shawl still draped across, it the old wood creaking beneath his weight. He had spoken little of his past since the day she arrived, but something in the storm outside and the deep hush of the house loosened his tongue. His voice was rough, low, as though he feared the words themselves might undo him. Her name was Clara, he said, eyes fixed on the fire. Fever took her. Springtime, when the pear trees bloomed. One day she was humming at the stove. 2 days later she was gone. The fire snapped, sending a shower of sparks against the stove's belly. Elias swallowed hard. After that, the house was just quiet. Too quiet. I worked the land, but it gave me nothing. I sat in this chair, listening to the wind. Year after year, it was only silence. Annika's gaze did not waver, though her face revealed little. She drew the shawl tighter, but said nothing until his words had faded into the crackle of fire. When she spoke, her voice was calm, but it carried a weight that reached across the space between them. I know silence, she said. It follows me, too. My father's kin looked at me and saw my mother's blood. My mother's kin looked at me and saw my father's. Neither wanted me. And when I was old enough, men saw me as something to claim. Not someone. Something. Her. Hands rested in her lap, fingers curled into the fabric. So I left. Walked farther than I thought I could. Carried scars with me. Some you can see, some you cannot. The wind screamed through the chimney, rattling the iron stove door. Shadows stretched long across the walls, flickering with the fire's restless light. Elias looked at her then, really looked and saw not only the bruises still healing on her face, but the weariness etched deeper, the kind that did not fade with time. Their words did not lead to romance. There was no soft declaration, no reaching of hands. What passed between them was quieter, heavier, more enduring. Two wounded souls laying their burdens down side by side, not to forget them, but to let them rest for a while in the company of another. The twins stirred once, then fell back into sleep, their tiny breaths steady as snowfall. Elias leaned back, in the rocking chair, eyes heavy, the shawl brushing against his hand. Annika sat across from him, firelight flickering in her dark eyes. Neither spoke further, but something in the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of loneliness, nor the silence of mistrust. It was the silence of two who had spoken enough for one night, and who would not be crushed beneath the weight of their own pasts. When Elias rose to add wood to the fire, Annika shifted the cradle closer to the stove, her movements careful, protective. Their eyes met briefly in that simple act, and for the first time since her arrival, Elias felt the faint stir of trust. Not demanded, not given outright, but growing, slow as roots under snow. The fire burned brighter, pushing back the dark. The storm raged outside, but within the walls of the homestead a fragile stillness held. Not peace, not yet, but something nearer to it than either had known in many years. And in that hush, with the babies breathing steadily and the shadows trembling on the walls, both Elias and Annika understood. Survival was no longer only about enduring the land or outlasting the storm. It was about learning to let another heart stand near their own without breaking it. The past did not stay buried beneath snow. It came riding hard from the south, carried by the crunch of hooves and the bitter cry of men who had long claimed dominion over others. Elias saw them first as shadows against the whitening horizon. 3 riders, cloaked against the cold, moving with the certainty of hunters. By the time their boots struck the porch, the sun had lowered into a pale, cold gleam, staining the snow with dying light. The wind tugged at the door as Elias opened it, rifle in hand, the barrel steady though his chest felt tight. The men were rough, dust-worn, eyes hollow with greed and hunger. Their leader stepped forward, his face scarred deep, a grin stretched, across it without warmth. "We've come for what's ours," he said, voice flat as gravel. His gaze slipped past Elias into the dim light of the cabin. The girl. She ran. Debt unpaid, promise broken. Hand her over. Elias stood in the doorway, broad shoulders filling the frame, firelight at his back casting him in stark shadow. His scar caught the glow, a line of pale defiance down his cheek. "She's no one's to hand over," he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of stone. Behind him, Annika stepped forward. She carried no weapon, only the weight of her resolve. She did not hide behind him. She stood beside him, her eyes sharp, steady as the snow drifting down. "The leaders," smile faltered. "You'll die for her then?" Elias lifted the rifle a fraction higher, the stock pressed to his shoulder. "If that's the road you aim to ride, then yes." The world stilled. Even the wind seemed to hush, holding its breath. Then with a snarl, one of the men reached for his revolver. The first shot split the quiet wide open. The crack echoed across, the snow ringing sharp against the empty plains. Elias fired, the recoil slamming into his shoulder, smoke curling up from the barrel. The man fell, red blooming against the white, staining it cruel and bright. The others scattered, one diving for cover, the leader drawing fast. Bullets tore the air, struck wood, shattered the porch rail. Annika seized the fallen man's revolver and fired back, her aim raw but true. Sparks leapt from iron, splinters flew, and the night filled with the thunder of gunfire. Elias moved with the steady calm of a man who had already stared into loss and found little left to fear. He fired again, his shot catching the second man, who collapsed into the drift, gasping until the snow swallowed his sound. Only the leader remained, crouched behind his horse, firing wild. His curses rang, broken by the howl of the wind. Then his gun jammed, a dry click where fire should have been. Silence followed, broken only by the ragged pull of breath and the faint cries of the twins from within the cabin. Elias stepped forward, rifle leveled, his boots crunching in the crimson-stained snow. The leader's eyes darted, cornered, and furious. "She's nothing," he spat. "A half-blood stray, you'll damn yourself for her." Hanika's voice cut through, clear and sharp as flint. "I am not yours, not now, not ever." Elias's finger tightened against the trigger, but he did not fire. He held the man in his sights, waiting, silent, as the land itself. The leader's breath came harsh and fast, his eyes wild, until at last he threw down the empty revolver and staggered back. "Go," Elias said. His voice was iron, final. "Take what's left of your shame and leave this place." The man hesitated, then mounted his horse with trembling hands. He rode into the falling snow, a shadow swallowed by distance, his curses fading into the wind. When the stillness settled again, it was heavy. The bodies lay where they had fallen, blood staining the pale earth. Elias lowered the rifle, his hands steady, though his heart thundered like hooves against his ribs. Annika stood beside him, breath clouding, revolver hanging at her side. Together, they dragged the dead into the dark beyond the homestead, leaving the snow to claim them. There was no glory, no triumph, only the grim necessity of survival. Justice had been written not in law, but in the harsh ink of the frontier, blood upon snow, silence in its wake. Inside, the fire still burned, low and steady. The twins wailed, voices sharp in the hush. Annika moved to them first, gathering them close, her shawl wrapping around their small forms. Elias followed, setting the rifle against the wall, its smoke still faint in the air. He feared she might leave then, burdened by the danger she had brought, by the violence now tied to his land. He feared she might vanish into the snow, another ghost added to the weight he already carried. But she stayed. She sat by the fire, the babies in her arms, her face soft in the glow. Not as a prisoner of fate, but as one who had chosen to remain, where scars did not define worth. Elias sank into the rocking chair, the wood creaking beneath him. The twins quieted, their breaths small and steady. Clara's shawl, long draped in mourning, now wrapped the children in warmth. The old fabric, once only memory, had become something living again. Snow fell outside, soft and unceasing, blanketing the world in silence. Inside, the fire whispered low, shadows swaying across the walls. No grand words were spoken. None were needed. Elias sat with the rifle resting silent, with the woman who had brought both danger and healing at his side, with the children breathing gently in the cradle. Loneliness had not vanished. Grief had not lifted. But in the hush of that winter night, dignity and belonging returned, quiet, earned, unbreakable. And for the first time in years, Elias Mercer believed the long ride of his life was not yet finished.